Recording. Okie dokie. So, I'm assuming everybody can see the slides that are now up on the screen. Please speak now, forever hold your peace if you can't. That's an all good. Yes. Yes. Simone, thank you. I did see that little thing. Okie dokie. So, welcome to the Australian Passive House Association webinar series. My name is Andy Marlowe, and I'm talking today about Passive House. What's it worth? Most of you are already members of the Australian Passive House Association, so firstly, a huge thank you for supporting us. As you all well know, we're a not-for-profit, and therefore we are incredibly dependent on and grateful to our members for the things they do for us, both financially and in terms of helping with the various things that we need to do to achieve our goals. So yes, welcome to today, and thank you for all that you have done in the past to help, and for those of you who wish to help do other things, please get in touch, because as many of you know, we have a lot of things we'd like to see done in the world, and time and effort is one of our key challenges. I thought I'd just give a blatant plug for the upcoming South Pacific Passive House Conference. It's end of May next year, so it's a little while away. There's still some sensationally cheap and arguably silly priced tickets available in the early bird releases. So if you log onto the website, you can sort those out straight away. It's in Sydney, as the graphic somewhat rams down your throat, for the very first time, so it's a fairly huge deal in that sense, and I mean, to be perfectly honest, it's about time that it got out of Melbourne, so all wonderful love to the Melbourne people. So yes, we look forward to it being in Sydney May next year. Abstracts, if you wish to present at the conference, are due by this Friday, so that's a whole 48 hours away, so heaps of time to procrastinate further, which is exactly what I've been doing. So Passive House, what's it worth? This is the story of a house that is now complete. It's in Sydney. You can see the address based on the screenshot. It's in the northern suburbs of Sydney, so it's a little bit away from the coast, but it's still suburban. And the key thing is it's a Sydney project, and that's going to come through strongly in what I'm going to talk about today, because that has influenced everything, which is no surprise, but it explains a few things as well. So while many of these lessons are applicable in other places, it is always context and location specific. We'll start with a bit of just background. Our client is there's two of them really, but one half of them is a scientist. He loves data. So this is his data from the house since they owned it, and pretty much until we knocked it down. And basically you can see the inside and the outside temperatures. There's a fairly strong correlation. To call it a tent would have been an insult to a tent, and there was a good reason that we knocked it down and started again. So if nothing else, it's a dramatic improvement upon where they were at before. As with all designers, we start with a brief. This is the synopsis of what they asked us to achieve. In many ways, it's not dissimilar to many of the other briefs that we work with in my day job, which I didn't mention, but anyway. So aside from being a director of the Australian Passive House Association, I'm also a director and architect and certified passive house designer at Envirotecture. So we're a small design firm on the northern beaches of Sydney. So this is fairly common for our brief. The one thing in this particular instance that is different is the tree. So it says there, keep the gum tree. It's a beautiful tree. It's actually a tallow wood tree. Quite majestic, fairly tall, and hard to tell from this photo, but it is almost exactly in the geographic center of the block of land, i.e. not where you'd really want it to be. Anyway, It was a constraint. In some ways, we love constraints. So based off that original brief, and the tree and all the usual things that we have to deal with as designers of buildings, we did what we did back then, which was default to a traditional passive solar design, in order to keep the people warm, keep the people cool, and deliver indoor comfort. These details are from a while ago, and these were fairly standard details for us back then. The architects among you will be able to decipher fairly swiftly what's going on, but basically we were using vapor permeable wraps on walls, insulating everything, and then we had a ceiling build-up, which I still quite like actually, which is a bit of a combo of foam and polyester bats, and back then we were using Anticon under the roof sheeting still. So this is sort of where we started. Everything's assumed to be made on site in this case. We have and still have a very good relationship with one particular local aluminium window manufacturer. By Australian standards, they make some really, really good product, double glazed, etc., etc. So we were defaulting to their product each and every time back then. In this particular design, in something that was slightly different for us, we did actually have one single operable external vertical shade device. Normally we rely entirely on eaves, but for reasons you'll see in a minute, this one always was going to have one of these external shades. This project also had water tanks. There's nothing unusual in that, except that there are 10 of them inside the house as well. That is fairly unique, and I'll talk about that as we go on. Heat pump hot water, and PV on the roof, and all of those things, which again for us were fairly standard back then. Bear in mind this project's got a longevity, like this has been kicking around for somewhere between 3 to 4 years, probably since we first actually sat down and had that first conversation with the client, so it's been a bit of an evolution. This is not the house. This is just water tanks inside a building. I have always had quite a strong personal desire that's hard to explain really, to put water tanks inside buildings. Have a bit of an affection for the wacky 1970s stuff that got done in the deserts of Southwest America, and things like this do sort of appeal. So this is the design of the home, and the great thing about this project and why it's turned into this talk is that this home's been through a series of evolutions in terms of builders, construction methodologies, etc., etc. But fundamentally, the one thing that's never changed is the actual geometry of the building. So it's by default become a fairly good case study. I am not a scientist, my partner is. But it turns out that I designed quite a good research project without designing a research project. So as you can see, north is up the page. What you can't see on these drawings is that on the left of the page is a fairly busy local road, and to the right at the back of the block, up a 8-metre high embankment, is the main northern rail line of Sydney, i.e. fairly large noise source. The big dashed line on plan is the tree, and you can see that the tree is fairly close to the house. And then you can also see in that in the drawing the 10 little circles, which represents the water tanks that are inside the house. But the planning's fairly straightforward, fairly rational. Living stuff closer to the sun, service stuff away from the sun. Smaller windows on the west, huge window on the north. That's a garage off to the top of the page. And all the roof angles and distances between are sorted out to optimise that big north-facing window by the water tanks for solar gain. The water tanks were not just a I wanted to do it thing, but were really put in originally back when before it was passive house, in order to get some thermal mass in the building. As you can see in the perspective top right, the house is all elevated above the ground. Because we wanted to save the tree, groundworks were not a good idea, so we used screw piles, and therefore everything is elevated, which therefore means no concrete slab, which therefore means no thermal mass, other than obviously the bits and pieces in the house, but nothing of substance, no concrete, no brick. and therefore hence water. So as many of you know, water's got double the thermal capacity of concrete, so it's actually a really good thing to use. Obviously, there's a reason people generally keep it out of their buildings, though. So anyway, client who understands science and not completely averse to risk. Hence, we got water tanks in the house. The upper level, again, fairly compact. 3 bedrooms, small second living room, bathroom, big family bathroom that's shared. Key to note really that there's no ensuite in here. That's a walk-in robe next to the bedroom there, but the joinery seems to have vanished, which is ironic because they haven't built the joinery in there yet. And then you can see the perspective up top right, and you can see those north-facing windows, and you can also see that there's some reasonable sized windows on the eastern facade as well. There's a few things that change minorly on that east facade, and you'll see that in the photo right at the very end. But that's the crux of the geometry of the house. Window sizes, overall opening sizes, haven't changed in a very, very long time either. So it's a fairly good case study in that sense. Now, like I said, we went through a whole series of iterations of how to get this thing built for the client's budget. And therefore, this next series of slides is really about what happened. So I will hopefully make it as entertaining and as informative as I can. For those of you madly wanting to keep tabs of things, I've got a document that has all these slides in it, which I'm happy to send you links to, so you don't feel you need to scribble everything down that's on the screen itself. So, our very first builder who got involved in this was a fairly competent builder who had a history of doing some fairly good homes. At this point, it wasn't a passive house. It was just, good passive solar design. This builder had been working on a system for a while where he was pre-cutting all of his timber and basically doing a Meccano version. So everything was getting pre-cut, stamped, labeled, delivered to site, and then assembled much quicker, so he claimed, on site in order to speed up and make the process more efficient. It also involved, which we did, optimizing certain things to try to get minimize wastage, etc., etc., etc. As you can tell from the way I'm talking, this was not the builder who eventually built the project. Now, the thing to explain about these slides is obviously you can see there that there's a whole bunch of color coding and there's some descriptions around what's in each of those buckets. You'll see as we move along why I've categorized things that way. Obviously, as all of you would know, builders never categorize everything the same way as the other guy. So there was a bit of work in aligning these things, but I'm confident that the categories are very representative of what's actually within them, and it's an important part of the story here. So builder one, not a passive house, going to make it on site, had a system that he claimed would make it work incredibly well and cost effectively. To be blunt, he was miles off his original estimate, which he verbally gave to myself and the client, and that probably more than anything else was the thing that got him thrown out fairly swiftly. So builder number two, again, competent. All the builders, were good, competent people. It's not like we're talking cowboys. At this stage, it's still not a passive house, so they're quoting on basically the same thing as builder one. Much more straightforward, built on site, stick frame, nothing particularly unique about the detailing. Exactly as those details I showed at the start. So you can see here when you start looking and comparing the size of their various colored the color bars, structure and insulation drop massively. Conclusion, of course, being that the pre-cut frame really didn't actually save anything. It might have saved the builder time, but if it did, it didn't translate into cost saving to the client. And also that builder one had made some assumptions about stuff which were basically incorrect, but due to the fact that he was already way north of where he should have been, we didn't bother to go and correct those things. So arguably his price would have gone higher again. Anyway, builder number two, not necessarily an unfair price for what they'd proposed, and certainly at the time a price that we thought was representative and not hugely surprising. So at some point between 2.1 and 2.0 and 2.1, we, with the client, made a series of decisions that ended up giving us a passive house. We changed the construction details, and I will talk about those. I think I have a slide on those in a while. So we changed how the walls were going to be built. We moved to a SIP panel roof. We changed the window suppliers, but not the actual opening sizes really. So there were a few changes, but the geometry remained the same. And obviously we added an HRV in, which hadn't been in the previous schemes. The delivering a certified passive house was now a contractual, delivering a house that achieves an air tightness test result of 0.6 air changes per hour at 50 pascals of pressure was a contractually required thing. We did that, because I'm not sure someone will ask, we did that by very simply putting it in the scope of works and just saying the building will achieve a blower door test of blah, 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 blah. And that was it. We didn't make it any more complicated than that. The builder understood what that meant, and that was not really raised as an issue at all. There were lots of questions about the detailing, but there was no questions per se about actually delivering the result or the fact that it was in the contract. I guess the next question would be, what happens if you didn't? Well, we did, so it doesn't matter. But if we didn't, I don't know exactly how that would have gone, but it could have been interesting. But I guess we were all confident we were going to get there. So this 2.1 quote also looked at using off-site panelization. And therefore it was really swapping out the on-site for the off-site and adding in that HRV that were the key differences to the one before, along with the wall change, which wasn't a particularly huge cost impact. So as you can see, the price went up a bit, but as you can also see, nearly all the other bars remained the same because there were no other changes to those, so preliminaries, etc., etc., etc. And I'll talk about the preliminaries in a sec. So this panelization was one tangent that we went off on quite some time ago now, and it had been inspired by me getting an idea in my head. And we spoke consciously to two different people, one making prefab wall panels in Melbourne, and the other making a very similar product in New Zealand. What was fascinating was that there wasn't a huge price difference landed in Sydney between the two lots of panels. Freight's a really interesting thing. It seems that distance in and of itself isn't the cost, which sort of makes sense, but is instinctively odd. And you can also see from the graphic here that we also had some European panels looked at as well. This wasn't a conscious choice. This was around the time we were really getting stuck into passive house generally, and we were getting hammered by people selling all manner of things that either were or they thought were useful for building certified passive house buildings. This was a panelized system that comes out of Estonia. A couple of people have used it since. I don't know any of those people well enough to know whether it went well or badly. But it was a not dissimilar construction method to the New Zealand and the Melbourne panels. They were bringing in a lot more of the stuff with it. So they were bringing in wall linings. If I recall, it came with the windows pre-installed as well. So there was more in it. So it was actually very hard to work out the genuine comparative cost. I mean, the thing that became obvious very quickly was that it was significantly more than it was not importing them from Europe. And my logical brain just went, well, that makes sense. So we moved on and didn't go back to that. What you can see is that the on-site costs are about the same, and in this case, fractionally more than the panel cost. This was all getting costed through the same builder. Now, the panel cost is the panel cost, of course. So those bars on the left are dictated by the supplier. And then the on-site costs are obviously the builder themselves. So my conclusions out of this were panels can be really cost effective, but it depends where the site is and where the panels are coming from, and that can be an absolute killer. The thing on this particular site that drove the final decision to build it on site was really around the fact that the panels weren't really going to be more or less expensive. It was fairly line ball with the builder. However, because of that busy road at the front, and it's also on a fairly unhelpful, almost chicane as well, site access was going to be complicated. And therefore, because there was no, in the builder's view, no real cost saving to be had, there wasn't enough of a benefit to deal with what he thought was going to be the pain of the site access. Now, one of the things that also became apparent, and we've since done a lot of work on trying to resolve, is builders' preliminaries. I'll just flick back to to the slide before. And you can see there that those preliminaries are a fairly big chunk. I think that represents about somewhere between 60 and 70K on a job. And that's not an unusual number for jobs of that size in Sydney. But what was interesting was we've now got a job where we're saving, roughly speaking, 6 weeks on site by going for prefab walls, roofs and floors. And yet we're seeing no corresponding decrease in preliminaries. And now we've been working with both this builder and others, and we're basically trying to address that because the logic of preliminaries is around, cost of running business, being on site, etc., etc. So if you're pulling 6 weeks out of a job, you should also be pulling money out of preliminaries. So that pricing has begun to shift and improve. It hasn't always been the easiest conversations with builders because they've never really thought about it that way, but they are coming around to that. And the other thing that I wanted to say around that is also, and this is another issue that we're still refining and in different stages of refinement depending on the builders, is also just around margin. So as you can see back in previous slide, margin and GST, I mean, thank God for the 10% premium on everything. Excuse me, I'm just going to have a drink. The margin, depending on exactly what the percentage is at the end, is obviously a fairly big chunk of dollars as well. And many builders, depending on how they present their pricing, tend to just add it on at the end. So here's the cost of everything plus 15% plus 10%, and there's your price. So we've been mounting an argument both for panelisation but also on windows and doors as well. The full margin is actually not really the way to go. In light of the effort required and the risk involved, it's quite hard to justify 15% on a $150,000 order of panels, for example. When all you think about from a builder's perspective is a couple of phone calls and organising a crane, and yes, they might have to assemble them, but that's separate. And charging what equates to $20,000 for a couple of phone calls is a little bit hard to justify. So we see cost efficiencies coming through in sorting those issues out with builders, but like I said, it's taken a while, and it can take a robust relationship at times to get those things to a point where the builder's still profitable as well. So never losing sight of the fact that we don't want the builder to get driven into the ground, because if he's not there next week, or if he can't finish this job because he's gone broke, then that's not in anyone's interests either. I wanted to talk a little bit about the windows as well. So one of the bigger myths, I guess, is that passive house windows are really expensive. My simple conclusion is no, they're not. My more nuanced version is, well, it depends what you compare them to. Like I said at the start, we have good relationship with a local manufacturer. They use, fairly good double glazing. Everything's locally made, and therefore we were paying a reasonable chunk of money for windows anyway. Now, obviously, if you compare a passive house window to a barely code compliant single glazed aluminium thing that's fairly flimsy and fairly terrible to look at, then yeah, you're going to see a cost increase. It's the equivalent of going from a push bike to a Tesla. But I'm not good with the car analogies, but in terms of cost, we're not going very far at all. And this little graphic here, this little table, is really looking at what happened on this particular job. So we had our original local friendly supplier on the left, The second one was an Australian UPVC manufacturer, so assembling sections imported from overseas and then triple glazing those. The reason we'd asked him for triple glazing was because we were trying to compare it performance-wise with the third bar, which was imported European UPVC windows, which came as triple glazed. When we first saw the quote come back and it said that they were triple glazed, being the cost-driven practice we can often be, we rang the supplier and it's like, oh, look, let's just make them double glazed. We'll save a few more bucks and, the client will be stoked. This will be great. Window guy rings us back 2 days later. Yep, well, you can, but they don't make double glazing anymore. So that'll be a special order and it'll be more expensive than the triple. What do you want to do? It's like, we'll just take the triple. That'll be fine. So when we got the Aussie UPVC guy to quote, we wanted it to be apples for apples. We didn't need the triple glazing in Sydney, I should say, which is why we were happy to downgrade it if we could. We wanted the price comparison to be honest, to be honest between the two, so it was apples for apples. And as you can see there, he got more expensive than the local stuff. He was more expensive than the imported stuff. And one of the key things to note. Just realised if anyone's typing in the chat menu, I can't see that because of my screens. So if you want to say anything, you'll need to spark up verbally. Happy for you to do so as well. Yes, one of the key things that we've noticed from a design perspective with the European windows is that the aluminium cladding on the outside, while some people were deeply passionate about protecting the UPVC from the sun, I'm confident that they've already sorted that problem out. But we find that the ability to change the color of the windows on the outside, design them differently at the start, is incredibly useful. And we've found that harder with the pure UPVC extrusions that the local guys have got. Although, to be fair, there's a few jobs where we have specified them, and they're pretty good. And cost-wise, they're panning out to be often cheaper than the imported stuff. Very much dependent on the design. But in this particular case, partly because of the triple glazing, it didn't work out that way. So I think I've danced around most of my key points on there. I will talk more about Windows later because we've since learned some things since I first put this presentation together. And I guess it should also be said that the exchange rate is a risk as well. But to be fair, that applies to a fair few things in Passive House. Because once you look at a few of the other bits that come from overseas, a big shift in exchange rate could be either a blessing or a curse. So, having talked briefly about the panels and the windows, let's get back to the house itself. So we're still with builder number 2. We're still Passive House. We've gone back to on-site construction because we needed to get we decided against the panelization for the reasons that I expressed before. There's been a little bit of refining, but as is often the case, the client has decided that they love the house the way it's already designed, and therefore let's just make the money work somehow, which is always quite reassuring from wearing your designer hat. And what you'll see here is that there was a bit of a decrease in cost, and this was almost entirely due to changing the cladding material. We'd previously spec'd something that was going to, so the builder informed us, end up with a phenomenal amount of wastage. And therefore was going to be very expensive, and they had a preference for a different product which would have much less wastage and therefore would be much cheaper. We were happy with the changing choice anyway, so we really didn't mind. Aesthetically, it achieved pretty much exactly what we were going to get before, and it saved the client a fair chunk of money. So we looked good, builder looked good, client was happy. That's about as good as life gets in our game. So, unsurprisingly, and slightly frustratingly maybe for builder number 2, at this point, so we've got a price, everyone's happy with the design, and then clients just wants to be sure that they're actually getting, the right deal for the price, because, it's still north of $800,000, which is, not nothing. So we went to a builder who we also know. He's not a certified Passive House tradesperson, and before we started talking about this particular job, he didn't really know much about Passive House at all. He's a thinking builder, which is one of the reasons I really like the guy. And he's asked a lot of very good questions. He understood it. and eventually he came back with a price. Eventually, not meaning to imply it took him too long, but sorry, after a while he came back with a price. And as you can see from the bar, it was a fair bit north of the other guy. In fact, it was like 150 grand north, which was a lot. So unsurprisingly, he was nowhere near getting the gig. But what was most interesting about this that I found was this explicit risk premium. He and I have a very good relationship. So when after he'd submitted the price, I talked to the client, and we'd all agreed that it was going to the other guys. I rang him and basically gave him the bad news, and he's like, oh, and he went through a very long explanation as to the fact that he'd vacillated between, I really understand the detailing and it's not very complicated, but at the same time, the fact it's an airtight building scares the bejesus out of me because I've never done one before, and I think I loaded the price too much. So obviously he did, but it was just interesting how his lack of experience in doing, even though he knew in his head how to do, really didn't come together in a way that was particularly helpful, in this case for him or the client or for us. What was fascinating is that about 2-3 months later, he tendered for another passive house against the same builder, and he ended up getting the job, and he was noticeably cheaper anyway. So he continued his sort of mental journey in order to work out exactly what he could and couldn't achieve. And he has actually just delivered a fairly fantastic blow door test result on a very small 60 square meter granny flat. So he's certainly come a long way in these few years as well. So we have a building. It's been priced a number of ways, and the purpose of this talk really is to look at what is the cost of passive house, and this is why I find all this data quite interesting. So what I've done is I've taken away all the stuff that's got nothing to do with passive house. So kitchens, bathrooms, preliminaries, site works, all of that stuff that's just part of building. And you can see that depending on which builder you're looking at, you get slightly different numbers, but let's just say it's about 30%. So therefore 70% of the stuff in construction has got nothing to do with pretty much whether your building works. The rest of it's just to do with people turning up and doing stuff, having insurance, paying GST, having kitchens and bathrooms. And obviously, depending on how many kitchens and bathrooms you have, those numbers can be wildly different. But I would maintain that this being a fairly efficient build, that this is probably an accurate representation of the proportional cost of stuff that relates to building performance in terms of thermal comfort and energy efficiency. So we've worked this out, and then if we start to look at the actual detail about the cost increases, we start to note that obviously it's gone up. So we're ignoring number one because it wasn't anywhere near passive, because it was basically just a number that was just inaccurate in my view. So we started from version 2.0. So that was good quality passive solar design, no HRV, no airtightness specifically, and therefore everything, so 2.1 onwards, is all about the increase in the cost. So we're looking at a 23% initially or 16% eventually increase in the cost of stuff to do with passive house. And the final one, number three, like I said, is mainly around the premium that was placed by the builder on airtightness there. So these aren't 16% of 31% really isn't a huge chunk of money. So this is then looking at the total dollar costs of the project. So this is up at the top there. So really we're looking at, we went initially to passive house and added $40,000. We then, when we went into 2.2, we took away, we found the saving in the cladding and a few other odds and ends, and we actually ended up coming down $22,000 from where we'd started at 2.0. So I guess my headline claim is that through good design, working with a builder, we managed to actually decrease the cost as we went from passive solar to passive house. One of the things I've completely forgot to mention so far is we actually got less insulation in terms of our value in the roof of this house than we would have had if we'd built it in our usual passive solar way. And that's mainly because we've got the accuracy and the confidence in PHPP to know that we can pull down some of those R value numbers and still get the performance that we need. So we've used that tool to really, work out exactly where our bang for the buck is. Like I've said, version 3 isn't worth too much debate in terms of its percentage differences. Although it might be useful in the sense that if you've got an inexperienced passive house builder and you're going from passive solar to passive house, in this case that was a 15% increase. In some ways that's still not terrible. I mean, it was a lot of money. It's $130,000, but it's certainly not the 40-50% that some people seem to be wanting to have a crack at. So we're taking quite a bit of positive news from this. So what I'd like to do now is just briefly talk about something that I deliberately ignored at the start, which is where we actually really started this project. So before we got involved with the builder number 1, in order to try and deliver the original design as cost effectively as possible, through the client he'd sourced a local building firm who were, I guess, what I'd call Project Home Light. They weren't one of the big mobs by any stretch, but they claimed to be building about 20 houses a year, and they were certainly aiming themselves somewhere above the mainstream Project Home market, but certainly not like in the custom, sort of the upper range of the custom builders either. And they quoted the job. As is the case with many of those builders, you get zero breakdown. You just get, here's a price. I understand that, but I find it frustrating. And what you can see from that graph there is that they were coming in just a little bit north of $600,000. There were some exclusions in there. We had some serious concerns over the quality they were going to deliver, but we were confident we'd contractually tie them up, so they had to. And so it wasn't a terrible price. It certainly looked better to the client in some ways, but those concerns, especially over quality, were really sort of weighing on everyone's mind. And this was all pre-Passive House as well. So as the project evolved and we became certified passive, or heading for certified Passive House, the client was fairly keen for us to go back to these guys. I was fairly interested. I was not confident we were going to get very far with them, but we had a crack anyway. And they refused to tender, which was actually quite interesting. It took a while for them to actually say that. They just ignored me for a while, but a lot of people ignore me. I seem to rub people up the wrong way at times. But they did eventually admit over the phone that basically it was all a bit too tricky and a bit too hard, and they'd rather not. So does that mean that there's a premium on Passive House from Project Homes? Well, yes, that's a fairly obvious statement. What is that premium? I think it's fairly hard to say. In cold hard numbers, the difference in this case between what we built being 2.2 and what the Project Home-esque guy started at is about 32%. But in the light of the fact that the Project Home guy can't deliver the Passive House, I'm not sure there's a great deal of value at this moment in time in talking about the cost difference between those two types of buildings. We have a client who did a huge amount of research on his own, different client, different project, trying to get a Project Home company to build him a certified Passive House. And he spent a lot of time talking to a lot of them, and he got fairly close with one, but at the end of the day, they just wouldn't commit to delivering an airtight building at this point in time. So that remains a challenge, I think, for all of us, and especially for Australian Passive House Association, is to get the wider industry up to speed. But we also believe, wearing both of my hats, that basically more people building these things is going to get more people up to the point where they can. So it's very much a build it and they will come approach. I just want to add a couple of things on Windows that I didn't say back at the other start. This is a completely different project, and I just want to use it to. This is partly about the things we've learned along the way, but really it's around the design of windows in buildings, because the Thornley has all these, is a very passive solar approach. It's got a lot of windows for cross ventilation. It's got a lot of windows full stop and a lot of windows that open. That's resulted in quite a bit of window area and also framing. And I've come up with a fairly, what I think is a fairly robust analogy is not the word, saying, whatever the phrase may be. Glass good, frame bad. Even with these windows, the frames are really, really good, but they're still not as good as the glass on the whole, and therefore having as little framing as possible is in everyone's interest. The frames are also fairly expensive, and the glass, compared to the frames, fairly cheap. So both from a performance and a financial point of view, reducing the frame glazing ratios is quite helpful. So just some numbers. I mean, you can see on the screen there, so it's a totally different house. This house is about 100 square meters larger than the Thornley house, but you can also kind of tell from the image, it's a perfectly stacked two-story building. So it's incredibly compact from a volume to surface area ratio. It's very much more rational in that sense, and therefore, I'm going to run out of power. And therefore, when you look at the percentage relationship of window costs, it was a lot higher in the Thornley house because of how we'd designed the windows. Now, also, the dollar differences are different between these projects, so it's not a completely fair thing to say that these two, the 6.5 and the 4.2, are entirely due to wonderful learnings in window design, but it really has helped to keep the costs down. And you'll notice in this image, and you'll notice in the images of the Thornley house, which I might have lost anyway, that we're also reverting to this approach whereby we have one opening sash in a window, and then the rest of it is just a large fixed pane of whatever size we need. So we're maximizing the sash size, basically dictated by the hinge's capacity to deal with the weight of the glass, and then everything else is just fixed glass. And this is a little bit aesthetic, but also based on the experiences of most people, in that most people aren't opening these windows very often, so let's just keep them simple. So I'd like to try and wrap up in a fairly coherent way. So these are probably my headline conclusions. The cost premium is definitely negligible or even non-existent if you're talking about custom design and you're making strategic decision making. And in that I include things like, being flexible on the cladding material, because fundamentally it'll look the same. And in the Thornley project in particular, the decision not to have an ensuite bathroom saved them tens of thousands of dollars, and they were very happy with that decision, and that enabled them to afford the house that they got. Not everyone's going to make that choice, but I guess I'd be... It's hard to accept that the passive house is the thing that's making things expensive if people are also not prepared to make the hard decisions about what they prioritize. So I think those conversations, which are often very awkward, need to be had very early on, and setting the benchmarks for what is important, preferably in a hierarchical order, is helpful. The cost premium to a project home is about 32%, but really that isn't the issue. The issue is they just can't deliver them at this point in time. That doesn't mean we should not try, but at the moment it's not working. The additional cost of windows are minimal, or in some cases non-existent. The cost saving from offsite prefab are very much location dependent, but also dependent on the builder and the margins and the preliminaries, as I talked about at length before. There is a huge benefit to working with a single builder and working through stuff with them. It is often hard to persuade a client at the end of that process that they have the best deal, and as we had to do here, you get someone else to legitimately quote to prove that. That's frustrating for the guy who's basically ends up wasting his time, but it's necessary sometimes. But hopefully with a body of evidence behind us, we'll have to do that less and less. And it is also worth mentioning the fact in this case with the two builders, the knowledge that the successful builders had in having done the certified tradesperson course really did help them in having the confidence to avoid that risk premium. So it was a good thing that they'd done it. At that point, none of them had built built one of these buildings, but they at least knew a lot more about how to build them. And that risk premium will vanish fairly swiftly for the builders who've done these things before. But in a first time situation, it is, as you could see from those numbers, at about 15%. It is a bit of a premium. So on that note, I thought there's a couple of photos from the house when it was just finished, so lacking landscaping and lacking there's a big shade sail that sits over that timber frame now. That's it just from the front. And then the water tanks inside the house, which we kept because everybody loved them. But from a thermal performance point of view, so they're accounted for in the PHPP, but we can take them out and we still pass with flying colours. But they will help and make it slightly better. And Matthew, being the scientist he is, has got temperature sensors in a couple of them, top and bottom, and can tell you what the water temperature is at any time you like. And if you want to, he's got a blog that he's writing about what happens in the house. So if anybody's interested in reading that, if you flick me an email, I'm happy to share a link to that as well, because it's quite interesting. And on that note, I will take questions and look at the chat thing and see whether you ask questions along the way. So thank you very much. I'm happy for you to ask the questions rather than type them if you want. There's a relatively small group of us. Question about builders' margins. So, did you have a case where the clients would pay the panels and or the windows themselves? If so, how did the builders treat the margin then? We did not in this case go down that route. We've done it on other jobs for a whole series of other things. Like, it's not uncommon for, say, kitchens to be done that way in the jobs that we do. It depends on the builder every single time. I would be in fact, we've had this recently. I advocate strongly that windows are not taken away from the builder. I'd be fairly reluctant to take the panels away as well. Because there's no one else in the supply chain who's really able to deal with the practical real world issues if something goes wrong, that's sitting with the client I find a bit risky. And from the builder's point of view, we all know that at the end of the day, if something went wrong with the panels or the windows, it's the builder that's going to have to sort them out. So our preference has been to negotiate the margin itself down to something that's realistic. And again, it really depends on the builders. One of the builders, different job, different builder, none of the ones I've spoken about today, on panels, I think we're talking a 3% margin. But it's a few $1,000s. But like you said, I'm not doing much. You do most of the work. Panel guy builds them, a few phone calls, crane, and then he's charging in his usual way for the installation price for actually putting them up and stuff. So that's what we've done there. Does anyone else want to chip in with anything else? No worries.
Oh, Amy, it's Linda. With the construction, with the tender to the builders, did you have the passive house detailing of the connections done in your documentation when they tendered?
Yes, we did. We did. Now, if we'd been doing a panelized system, I guess, depending on whose panels, but thinking about the only certified panel system in the country, if we were using that, then you wouldn't need to, because the panel system itself is designed to be airtight and would be airtight because that's what they're contractually delivering you. So because ours was conceived as built on site, yeah, we had to do all that detailing.
Okay, thanks.
You could not, but then depending on your builder, the struggle then is you don't know that they're going to achieve it. You don't know that they really know what they're doing, and there's just a lot more risk. So, yeah, I'd advocate for having that sorted out in one way or the other. Cool. Well, if there's no more questions, I'm very happy to take more if there are. Please don't be shy.
Oh, so Andy again.
Yeah.
Do you think there's any value of engaging their builders earlier in this design phase?
Definitely. Definitely. I mean, we, in this particular case, I guess did it slightly differently in that well, actually, not completely. Yeah, the earlier they're involved, the better. Um, Knowing you as homeowner rather than as coming from, let's say, my point of like where I come from as designer, we go back to builders again and again, so we don't always need to engage them as early because we already know their preferences, etc. But yeah, having someone involved early on is always going to be helpful, mainly because builders see things very differently to everyone else. We're getting into a new tangent where we're making sure that the builder actually comes on the very first site visit that we do, because they will see a whole bunch of things which are often very dull, normally involving stormwater, and they'll see things which need to get resolved that we won't necessarily see. And often there's easy solutions, but sometimes it's something that's going to add 50 grand to a project. So if it needs to be done, it needs to be done, but you also need to know about those kind of things early. So the earlier you've got builders looking at jobs, the better they tend to go.
Thanks.
That's okay. And look, there's a series of different ways to engage with that. Like, it's not uncommon for builders to get involved early and charge for the time they put into a job. And the general proviso with that is if they get the job, then they'll give you back whatever you've given them, because that's the money, the time that they would normally sacrifice in winning work. Because from a builder's point of view, obviously, they don't want to spend time preparing projects unless they're actually going to build them. So managing how that occurs can be challenging, but paying them normally solves that problem fairly easily.
Thanks. You said you were going to say something about the east window, the external shade, but I think you only talked about the shade sail. Was that due to morning sun in the summer?
What was I going to say? Oh, I think it was just the fact that we ended up taking away so there's shades on the west-facing windows. The fixed. Hang on, you can't see my screen now, can you? Hang on. Let me. Oh, Oh no. Oh, sorry everybody. Oh, hang on. Hello, is that working?
We see you. We don't see your.
Yeah, that's okay. That's because I hit the wrong button. I disconnected everybody. Sorry. You really don't want to be seeing me. Sorry. Screen. Go for that screen. Show. Go there. Alright, so if we go back, so on the west windows here you can see these shades that sit really close to the head of the window, and that's to try and block out as much western sun as possible, so having that shade device as low as possible makes that better. And then you'll see around on the eastern side at the back we don't have those, and we took those off basically because the modelling, we did a better job of modelling the shading impact of the tree, and we also realised that they weren't making a huge amount of difference. There's a bit of shade from the railway line and the trees at the back of the property that you can't see in this photo. So basically we just went, nah, we'll save a few bucks and pull them out, and it's not going to make any fundamental difference to the performance of the house. Again, it's one of those things you can do when you've got confidence in your modelling software. So, yeah. Cool. All right. Let's go back into the chat thing. But look, if no one else has any further questions, I'll thank you all for attending, and yeah, wish you a wonderfully happy, warm-ish afternoon wherever you are in the country. So, yeah, I hope you all got something useful out of it. There will be more webinars running in the new year. Stay in touch through the newsletter and various other social media channels. And yeah, have a lovely afternoon. Thank you all. Have a great day. Bye-bye.